It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'm Terell McSweeny. I am a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission, but only for another couple of days. Still, I'm going to give a disclaimer to say that I am here just giving you my personal views, not the official views of the FTC. So please be mindful of that, I guess. So at some point today, I'm guessing most of us jumped on Wi-Fi, maybe at home, right, and connected to via a router to the internet, on a dial-up modem and that like old thing that went brr, 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 like that, and that Mike helped bring to the internet. Thank you, Mike. We may not have thought much about the fact that the government actually made that possible. So the Federal Communications Commission, a long time ago, told AT&T that it needed to allow user-chosen equipment to be attached to its network through standard jack. And that development led to the deployment by consumers of modems. FCC also told the telephone companies that it needed to allow to carry data in a non-discriminatory manner on its network. And I start with this anecdote because I think these are critical government actions to prevent AT&T, at the time a very dominant firm, and the dominant telephone companies from destroying budding innovations by allowing online services to subsequently flourish. So fast forward to the topic of today, the tech titans. I don't think we're really defining them necessarily. We're just saying there's some really big companies out there. I think it's important to dial down the rhetoric here, and I'm going to suggest that my job is just to convince you that some government intervention may be appropriate, but not to convince you exactly what the right prescription is, because I'm not sure we're there yet. So let's take a look at the problem. Digital platforms are young. The internet is still a very dynamic and innovative space, but some have clearly emerged as fairly dominant. Google and Facebook, for example, have 60% of digital ad spend. Digital ad spend is rapidly growing as a share of total ad spending, expected to surpass other forms of ad spending by 2020. Amazon, for example, has 100 million Prime members and 45 to 50% of the holiday retail market in 2017, which was up 38% from 2016, so we see very rapid growth there as well. Now, it is perfectly legal to growth by, and I don't believe that big is necessarily bad. I also believe that big is not necessarily good either. So we'll get into this, I think, a little bit, especially given the title of Robert's book. But I do think these facts are pretty undeniable. So I think it's good for government to carefully monitor the situation and to act to promote innovation and competition. The government has a variety of tools it can use to do this. One is antitrust enforcement, the other is regulation. And the goal should be, when it uses these tools, to use them to address openness, interoperability, and competition. Innovation does not always flow from large firms with deep pockets. Whether you believe in Schumpeter, which is an economic theory that a temporary monopoly is a reward and incentive to innovate, or Arrow, who believes a monopolist has an incentive to innovate, but it's relatively low because its interest is in primarily protecting the status quo, one thing appears to be consistent about all of this literature, which is that firms with market power have incentives to interfere with the cycle of creative destruction by impeding rivals' ability to develop the products that may pose a competitive threat to them. So the target of government intervention should be innovation excluding conduct, raising rivals' costs, force-free riders, other kinds of conduct that can really preclude innovation. And if digital markets are dominated by firms that maintain their market power through anti-competitive conduct, the government should also act against it. I want to take on a couple of myths. I think that the internet economy is not uniquely self-correcting, and I think that platforms are largely customer experiences, goods supported by advertising, so competition is unlikely to drive stronger consumer data rights. So if openness and interoperability and innovation are appropriate North Stars for government intervention, then government intervention will also be necessary if we want to achieve better consumer data rights, which I believe are going to be incredibly pro-competitive, pro-innovative, and necessary for our digital age. So If speech and free flow of information and data are also social, we will need the government. I think it's very unlikely to achieve those results by relying on massive companies to act benevolently, especially given the economic history of the United States. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
We didn't have to use a full 7 minutes, did we?
No signal. You did great.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Jim and Ken and Mike and my colleague, the commissioner. 3 more days left, so
Soon to be former.
soon to be former, so you might as well enjoy. So the title of this debate is Tech Titans on Trial. Do Internet Giants have too much power? Should governments intervene? The answer is no and no. This is one of those strange cases where 10 years ago we were talking, or even 15 years ago, about the idea of having a supercomputer in your pocket, being able to go online and quickly find something in a foreign language and have it immediately translated into your own language, and being able to connect, buy on up to 480 million products from a company like Amazon. 99.9% of Americans would say, this is fantastic, I want to be in that world right now. That's the world we live in. And we've all gotten, it's like teenage kids who get a little bit, they live in a nice house and they start complaining that they want to live in a better house. We live in a great house right now, and most Americans, by the way, believe that. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, 75% of Americans trust technology companies to do the right thing most of the time. It's really only a small share of activists, elite pundits, and competitors who now see it as fashionable to decry big tech. Robert Reich says big tech is way too powerful. Robert von Bergen for the Conservative National Review says Google, Facebook, Amazon are digital overlords. And even Bill Galston and Bill Kristol, sort of moderates or centrists, recently wrote, challenging the tech titans, calling for Standard Oil-like breakups. So this is a pretty clear statement of where a lot of folks are thinking. And basically you can sum it up as big tech bad, little tech good. But let me be clear on the debate tonight. The debate is about, do big internet and tech companies have too much power? It's not, do we think that there are some things going on in the digital economy that we don't like? So we can have a nice debate about privacy, but if we're going to have a debate about privacy, that has to be size neutral. We can have a debate about all sorts of things, but the debate tonight is a pretty simple one. Would we be better off? Would it solve all these other problems more easily if we broke up big tech companies and regulated big tech companies, not all these other companies? I would also add, I agree with Commissioner McSweeny, I am not a libertarian and I believe the government should do something, but I think the government has 3 big choices. They can abdicate, they can regulate, or they can facilitate. I'm a big believer the government can play an important role in facilitating innovation, but I reject the notion here that we need to regulate. So Mike Lind and I, my colleague Mike, who's now at UT Austin, just wrote this book for MIT Press, Big is Beautiful, which I encourage you to, so doesn't matter if you read it. But one of the points we make in that book, a pretty simple point, is on average, in the tech industry, outside the tech industry, large firms significantly outperform small firms, on average. They're more innovative, they create more jobs, they pay higher wages, they do all the things that we want companies to do, on average. But why are internet firms big? We have certainly these big firms, unprecedented perhaps. Why are they big? Let me read a quote from the Obama Council of Economic Advisors. Quote, some newer technology markets are characterized by network effects with large spillovers from having many customers use the same products. Markets in which network effects are important, such as social media sites, may become dominated by one firm. How many of you would like the government to break Facebook up into Facebook and Headbook? So now you have to use 2 different things. If I want to communicate with my, I'm going to post something on Facebook. I had this great debate, which I lost tonight. And if I do that, I'm going to have to post it twice, or go on my Twitter and then my other Twitter. There's a reason why there's one of these things, and it's because there are network effects and consumers want them. The other way to think about that is that we have to look at what the proper market definition is. Commissioner McSweeny talked about the ad market. First of all, how many people here pay for your Facebook subscription or your Google subscription? The answer would be, you don't pay for those things. They're free. So the market is not the search market. The market is not the social networker. The market is the ad market. So from a competitive perspective, from an antitrust perspective, it's the ad market. These companies at best have 25% of the of the total ad market. No antitrust economist would say a 25% share of two firms is anti-competitive. We hear a lot about some of the bad things that they might do, like eventually they might raise prices. Amazon eventually might raise prices. But as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. I love Amazon Prime. Let's all take advantage of it while we can. Eventually, maybe some bad things will happen, but historically, technology has always disrupted this. We could have had the same debate number of years ago, and we would have been talking about that big bad behemoth Walmart, or IBM 30 years ago, or those older RCA. So we've had this in the past, and always what's happened is innovation has come along. There's two reasons, and I'll close by saying why we should tread lightly here. One is we need these companies to invest this massive amounts of money that are going to be needed to transform the economy over the next 20 years with technologies like AI and blockchain. We need big, massive companies like Amazon to come in and disrupt healthcare. How long are we going to wait for the healthcare industry to fix the healthcare sector and modernize it? A long time, because they're not doing it. Big companies like Amazon, Apple, et cetera, they have the deep pockets to make big, risky bets. If you look at the top 20 R&D performers in the world, 5 of them are tech companies, American tech companies, Amazon, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, Apple, and Facebook. Collectively, they invest $58 billion last year in R&D. That is 7 times more than the National Science Foundation budget. So we need these companies for innovation. And then the second thing, I'll close, if we break them up, if we make them weak, if we hobble them like we did with IBM and RCA in the past, I know who our digital overlord is going to be, and it's not going to be an American company, it'll be a company from Beijing.
Thank you.
All right, well, apparently I'm an elitist, which is odd because I think in the introduction, Robert, it was clearly established that you bike like 10,000 miles on the weekend, and I drive a tractor, so I don't know how that makes me. But I will say it's not my job to argue here that the government intervention ought to be breaking up these very successful, huge companies. That is a proposition that then there are arguments for it. People are making those arguments. It's my job to convince you that the government has a role to play in perhaps figuring out how to impose some restraints here that are both pro-competitive and pro-innovative and pro-consumer, but protect some of these widely held values that I think we also want to protect in a democracy, like freedom of information, freedom of speech, access to multiple sources of information. So I was interested in your point that you think they have about 20, like Google and Facebook have about 20% of the digital ad spending. I think, or the overall ad spending, right? And I think, okay, so they have 60% of digital ad spending, probably more than that at this point. But I think the latest numbers I've seen suggest that the overall percentage of ad spending is closer to 35 or 40%, and it's on its way up, and that line looks like this, right? So the people are moving to online spending. So there's a problem for our content companies and our news organizations that rely on ads, and Ken's written a lovely book about how awesome it was for Google to disrupt the ad industry by eliminating the magic from advertising and making ad spending more efficient and less expensive. So that was cool, and from an economic perspective, very innovative and a good use, very efficient thing. But has created this kind of broader problem, which is we have a bunch of content companies, especially news organizations, that are deeply suffering. And I think that's an issue that we need to be thinking about. And then Robert's also arguing that Big companies are inherently, because they're big, really important drivers of innovation. And he's not completely wrong about that, but he's also not completely right about it. The really big companies that were really, really big, but not particularly good at innovating. I think maybe U.S. Steel, right, when steel markets opened, or the big three auto industry, right? Not awesome at innovating until they had a lot more global competition and a couple government bailouts. Even the technology companies themselves, Microsoft. I see a lot of people wearing their Google Glass around tonight on their Google Plus network. A lot of the big technology companies that we're talking about are investing in R&D, and I agree with that, but they're also not necessarily awesome at innovating themselves. So there isn't necessarily something inherent in bigness that makes you great at figuring out how to innovate. Lastly, I'll say you're absolutely right that the frontier here is real advances in artificial intelligence. I started with an example of the internet as a communications platform on networks, but we're fast moving to the internet as a thing that connects us all on our bodies through wearables, maybe enhancement devices. It will be important for medical devices. It's in our cars. It's in our homes. It's going to be very intimate connections for all of us. And a lot of it will be powered by increasingly powerful and autonomous technology that anticipates our needs and predicts things for us and is quite helpful and wonderful, and I do want to live in that world. But I want to suggest to you that relying on the current powerful incumbents as the only sources of the way we get to that world is a huge mistake. And historically speaking, it is government investment in innovation that helps us drive new achievements and advancements that gets us to some of these innovations, not just the private sector alone. And it's going to take, I think, some policies to really think about freeing up and opening up data so that there are people in garages who want to train their cool system, have access to that data, and have a secure and responsible way that they can build and train their new technology. I don't really want the future robots that are going to be, raising my children and driving my parents around to be governed solely by giant global corporations that I am not necessarily able to hold accountable.
So, we agree on a bunch of different areas. So I think we would both agree that one important role in antitrust is the conduct standard. And I think, without getting into all the details, the Microsoft case was probably a good case because it focused on conduct. It didn't want to break Microsoft up into this way or that way. It just said, your conduct is limiting firms' ability to be on your platform and to innovate. That's fine, and I think that is an active role for government. So government should be policing large as well as other tech firms to make sure that they're not using power in an inappropriate anti-competitive way. That's different than a size-based standard, which we used to have in the 50s with the Harvard Conduct Structure Performance Model, where we would say that mergers between two firms that lead to 10% global U.S. market share were somehow a problem. The second component of this is that we have long, at least since the 1980s, our antitrust regime in the U.S. under both Republican presidents has been based on the consumer welfare standard, not on a producer welfare standard. And if a big firm, by competing fairly, beats a small or mid-sized firm or another big firm, as long as consumer welfare is being helped, that's something we've accepted. And I think that's one of the reasons the U.S. leads in innovation as opposed to the Europeans, which is much more about the producer welfare standard. A couple of small nits. A recent study I saw from about a month ago from eMarketer suggested actually that the share of ads by the big two, Google and Facebook, is actually going to be going down as more and more companies get in this space. That's an interesting empirical question, which we will see. You mentioned also that some of the big companies aren't as innovative. I can mention in the book, there's really interesting new research using the new NSF data that just came out about 4 or 5 years ago, a whole new series of measuring innovation in U.S. companies, which we've never done before. We've only measured R&D. And when you really mine that data, what you find is very interesting. Large companies, on average, get a bigger bang for the buck per R&D dollar than say that maybe Microsoft is this or that. The evidence shows large firms are more innovative than mid-sized and small firms. Second, I'm surprised to hear the commissioner say that some of these large firms haven't given us much. We would be nowhere near the pace of our autonomous vehicles without Google jumping into that and taking a huge risk. Toyota, Ford, Mercedes, they all are in that space now because Google went first. Amazon and robotics, they're transforming the whole notion of robotics and warehousing. I don't see mid-sized companies having the scale to do that. Amazon with its clerkless or self-service store, maybe that'll work, maybe it won't work. I just saw something that, Amazon and drones. A lot of the drone innovation is coming from companies like Amazon, from Google. Language translation. I mean, there's just a whole slew of things that these big companies are bringing to us on average. Also, one of the claims that that some people in this space make, that we should be somehow going after big companies, they have too much power, they're sucking up all the oxygen and they're squeezing out all the opportunities. It's interesting when you look at it, though. We had a database of over 6 million new firms in the US and 10 technology industries, which we're able to analyze. And just to give you an example, 2 industries. From 2007 to 2015, there were 20% more software startups in 2007. There were 27% more data processing firms. So the 5-year survival rate is for these technology firms is actually 17 percentage points higher than it was in '99. So at least from the broad startup high technology ecosystem in the United States, the evidence doesn't suggest that they're being crushed. The last point I'll make is one of the reasons I think we've had consolidation is if you buy into this notion of Schumpeterian innovation long waves, essentially. Joseph Schumpeter postulated that innovation is not linear, it comes in big chunks. And what happens at the beginning of a period when a whole new innovation system comes around, what Schumpeter and other economists call a general purpose technology, like the internet, like electricity, like autos, is you have an enormous swarm of entrepreneurs and capital going because you don't know who's going to win. And so then what happens is there's a shakeout. I mean, we had 120 auto firms in 1910 or 1915. Well, you can't support 120 auto firms in the US, and so there's a shakeout. Same thing today. What I think the real question is this next wave of innovation, the core thing that government policy has to do, besides investing more in science and research and STEM education, is to just make sure that the big incumbents don't use unfair means to squash new entrants. As long as we do that, I think we're in good shape.
Thank you. Let me use my prerogative to ask some questions of each of you. Do you consider today Facebook and Google to be monopolies? Do you believe today that Google and Facebook are in effect monopolies?
Absolutely not. Because
who is
the New York Times, it's ad billboards, it's television. They're in an industry that is an advertising industry. Here's a classic definition of a monopolist. They limit supply and they increase price. You can't say Facebook or Amazon or Facebook or Google have limited supply or increased price. Their market is advertising, and if they were to have market power in advertising, then I think that's an appropriate thing to consider, but they don't have it now.
Does Facebook have market power in social networks? Who competes with them?
Ken, my point is it's irrelevant because it doesn't matter because, first of all, we're never going to have 2 social networks. That is a market where only one is realistic. Same thing with Twitter. You're not going to have 2 Twitters. You're not going to have 2 LinkedIns. How many people have multiple professional networks? There's a reason why network effects create one player. The market, though, is not that. The market is the ad market.
But if network effects creates one player, then how do we reach your nirvana of competition flowering and coming into play?
Well, first of all, I think social network is a pretty mature industry. I don't. What are they going to do? Give us, emojis? I don't think that's the area. The real question is the next wave of innovation, whether it's blockchain or AI or autonomous systems, robotics. Who's going to dominate those? And I don't see any evidence that Facebook is going to be dominating, using their monopoly, if you will, leverage there. I just don't see it happening. And more importantly, what's the alternative? Because the alternative would be to make people's lives miserable. Because I just don't think you can show any evidence that Facebook is using their, quote, market share for anything that's anti-consumer.
And when you said in your opening statement that you want the government to help facilitate, what is the difference between facilitate and regulate?
So facilitate could be things like ensuring that we spend more money on computer science education in the US. It could be things like making sure that our foreign competitors, like China, like India, our whole set of competitors who are playing unfairly and cheating, essentially enforcing forced tech transfer, stealing IP, that would be facilitating. Another area would be things like, could the government have a national IoT strategy where they encourage smart cities? Could they be adopting autonomous systems? So there's a whole set of things government can do to help.
What about, would you allow for the government, for instance, to say that Facebook maybe shouldn't be allowed to, or Google should not be allowed to buy up potential competitors, in Facebook's case, something like Instagram?
No, again, first of all, I'm always struck when I'm sitting in a cafe in Geneva and I'm able to talk to my daughter in real time with a video chat using Facebook and WhatsApp, and I'm like, and for free. I don't see that this is a problem in the world I live in. They've built. Now, the question is, could there be things that Facebook wants to buy that are problematic from an antitrust perspective? Absolutely. I'm not a libertarian. But my point is, where they are now doesn't seem to have crossed that line.
Let me ask you one last question before I turn to the commissioner over here. You didn't dwell on the question of privacy. And in fact, you cited Edelman Trust Index, I think incorrectly, that said that these digital companies were more popular than I think that both that trust and other recent surveys suggest they are. And one of the reasons why they have lost some altitude among the public on the trust factor is because of privacy and the concern. So what role do you see for the government, if they are in the advertising business, as you say, what is the role of the government to assure that citizens' privacy is protected?
Yeah, so a couple things. Well, the Edelman study, they have lost altitude, but their altitude was even higher before, so I don't disagree they've lost altitude. Key thing to remember in privacy,
now.
Pardon?
I think it's 50%.
I
don't trust.
Could be. At last it was 70, but we've been working with a Hill office, I won't say who has a bill. There's like a whole slew of bills now after the Facebook, quote, problem, which, by the way, was not a Facebook problem. That was somebody using Facebook data against the rules. One of the points, by the way, that people forget about that, Facebook started a program 5 or 7 years ago where they share data with researchers, social science researchers, and the researchers agree not to divulge anything, and the discoveries from that program alone have been really about postpartum depression, about air pollution, about all these things that we didn't know because we didn't have the data. The thing on privacy, one of the bills that is trying to being introduced in the House, not introduced, but being considered in the House right now, would put a whole slew of regulations on these companies. You have to have an audit, you have to all that. Every single big technology company is already doing all of those things that in this particular bill would mandate. What would be the companies who would be covered in that bill are companies or organizations like mine. I don't have enough money to go hire a lawyer to do a privacy audit every 2 years. And the final point I'll make on that, Ken, is we can have a debate about privacy. Should we move to a more GDPR-like regime, which, by the way, guaranteed The reason why you don't have many internet companies in Europe is because the GDPR reduces ad revenue from ads by about 50%, according to the pre-GDPR regime, GDPR being worse, according to Catherine Tucker at MIT. We can have a debate about that, that's fine, but that has nothing to do with size, because if I want to live in the world of GDPR I want to live in, it needs to apply to every single internet company, big and small, because the privacy risks are the same.
Let me turn to you, thank you, Commissioner, and ask the same question I began with earlier. Do you see Facebook and Google as monopolies?
Well, I think there's a technical term there, and then there's the feeling that we have, and these are slightly different things. So I would say, technically, from an antitrust perspective, what matters to us are antitrust markets. They're typically smaller, better defined than just a broad sense of how many users or how much ad revenue. But when you look at the proportion of the digital ad market, for example, you see that these are companies that are very powerful of market power. So it's a starting point. We look from there to see how they are using that market power, whether there is a pricing impact. But we don't just look at price. And this is important when we think about technology. We look at the consequence to innovation and the consequence to quality as well. So it can be that in fact there isn't necessarily a price effect in the traditional sense of a monopolist raising rents, right, and charging monopoly prices. It can be that there's an innovation effect there as well. So I think it's worth scrutiny, and I would argue against self-interest as a soon-to-be former FTC commissioner that agencies may not have looked as carefully as they should have at some of the acquisitions by these companies that have led to their immense power right now.
But as a antitrust lawyer and someone who worked in the antitrust division, for 4 decades now, antitrust policy has revolved around the notion of consumer harm. Mm-hmm. How could you make the argument that consumers are being harmed when these products and these places are free?
Well, consumer harm can come in the form of a harm to innovation and a harm to quality, because consumers benefit, as we all do, from innovation.
But has argued that there's been a massive amount of innovation by these companies.
And I think there has been innovation. There's also been a massive amount of acquisition by them. So innovation via acquisition is sort of a separate form of innovation R&D investment. But I would argue that you could certainly value privacy competition, which, by the way, doesn't really happen in the messaging social network space right now, as a quality competition that consumers value and that we ought to value in antitrust law as well. That would be on the free side of that two-sided market, which of course you have the paying side, the ad revenue side, and this is easier for us economically because we see numbers and money and we can quantify something there. It's harder when you have the network effects in the free side of the platform, when you're looking at more of an innovation and quality effect, and it's not necessarily numeric, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And in fact, the agencies revised their merger guidelines in 2010 specifically to articulate more clearly the fact that they can bring standalone quality and innovation effects cases.
So here you are worried about competition, innovation, too much power. But I haven't heard from you. You shy away from the notion of breaking up these companies. What's your answer?
Well, in the antitrust toolbox, we have a variety of remedies. So I think I've actually already won the debate in that Robert already agreed with me that some government action is necessary to protect consumers. It just needs to be the appropriate.
What government action?
Well, so even Robert agrees that if a big company is abusing its market power and preventing new innovators from entering, that the government can take action there. And so I think that's an appropriate role. But
do you worry, Robert, that would create and basically retard innovation if government was able to do that?
Well, just to be clear, I didn't say if somebody's preventing a new entrant. I said if they're unfairly preventing a new entrant. The whole point of being a company, and the whole point of being a company is to gain as much market share and as much profits as you can, and the goal is to kill your competitors. That's what we're all about. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is if they're leveraging parts of the network or their access in certain ways that are demonstrably unfair or anti-competitive. Government has long been involved in that. That's fine. That's very different than just going after them because they're big.
Do you think you're guilty of just going after them?
No. No, and I don't even think that's what I'm arguing. I don't think that, I think declaring something a monopoly and saying it has to therefore be kind of trust busted. I mean, we are standing here in a club that Teddy Roosevelt helped found, which is kind of fun since he was a trust buster back in the day, is a pretty undefined thing. So we have to be very, very careful not to throw a century of economics when we're thinking about how to use these tools. But I don't think that means we shouldn't look at market structure and antitrust analysis. So what do I mean by that? How could both of those things be true? Well, I think market structure is a very nice starting point. I want to know, is it a 2-to-1, a 3-to-2, a 6-to-5? I want to know who's the competition in there, because the job of a competition enforcer is to look at the kind of competition that's occurring and the harm to competition that may result from an activity or has resulted from an activity, whether it's a merger or conduct, and whether a remedy is required. So breaking up companies, which has been done by antitrust enforcers in the past, is a remedy. Whether it's the right remedy requires a far more precise look at exactly where the market power is and what the problem is. And because we have these economics of network effects in these markets, I think it may be very hard to have competition yield all of the results we might all value collectively together, things like better privacy, more data rights and control, and more innovation flowing from new entrants who are, able to enter and compete with these companies.
It would appear that privacy is an issue that in the U.S. The public seems less concerned than they are, say, in Western Europe. But if you listen into, including some of the dumb questions that members of Congress asked Zuckerberg, it seems that the Congress itself is very agitated about the privacy issue. Are you, and what would you do about it?
So I think it is correct to say privacy is kind of one aspect of the issue that we're all really worried about here. And the issue we're worried about is manipulation. And we really are a very trusting people. This is a great American value that we are all about trusting new technology and innovation. So consumer trust is a foundation. It's also really key for demand, right? So it's a good thing for consumers to trust new technology, because then they'll buy it and adopt it and use it, and then we get more of it, and that's a healthy, virtuous cycle. So we have to be careful here, though, because it's clear that the consent model we've been relying on, in which people are asked to assess adequately the risk of transacting and sharing in their data, and consent to that and then kind of move forward, is really based on individuals, one, understanding the transaction that they're engaging in, two, and meaningfully assessing the risks and consequences to them and to others of doing it. What seems clear to me from either the members working, they really didn't understand how they were consenting. And I think what's problematic here is we're also asking companies themselves to really understand the consequences and the risks and address them in a proactive manner. And they don't even completely know, I think, the consequences of some of these issues at scale, CEG, the fact that we can now use the technology to target democratic institutions, whether that's filling the Federal Communications Commission record with troll comments in the open internet proceeding, or targeting voters with disinformation campaigns. So there's a huge set of collective risks here that I don't think we're adequately addressing, and I don't think the companies are adequately addressing them.
Well, with that, we're ready for closing arguments.
So, a couple of key points. One, there's a fairly solid economic literature. Not everyone agrees with it. Ken Aulletta wouldn't agree with it, but that innovation and market share are an inverted U. So this is work of Phil Aghion at Harvard and Schumpeter originally, that if you have too much market share, you don't have an incentive to innovate. If you have too little, you don't have any profits because everything's competed away. And so, in part, this is a little bit like the Laffer curve. I guess we're having a discussion about where on that curve are these companies. I would argue they're pretty close to the top. And maybe more acquisitions might move them over, and they should be reviewed. But I think pretty close to the top right now, where hard-pressed to say that Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, IBM don't have huge incentives to understand that if they don't innovate, they're going to die. The second would be this question about privacy. The Commissioner and I think, fundamentally agree that, as I think we agree on antitrust, the role of the government is on enforcement. So under Section 5 authority, the FTC can and has brought a number of privacy cases for companies that have been scofflaws. Great. Absolutely should do that. We've publicly supported cases like the Wyndham case. But that's very different than saying we should adopt a GDPR regime in the US, which if we do that, we can be guaranteed that we will not win the race for AI. Because the GDPR has a slew of provisions that make it virtually impossible to use data. And then the last point I'll make is I think we have to remember the history and have a little bit of humility. In the book, we talk about a very well-known case in the 50s where the federal government, the Justice Department, thought it knew best about innovation and markets. And the dominant monopolist of the time was a company called RCA, which, by the way, was created by the US government in 1919. So RCA was dominant in color TV. They were dominant because they spent the most money on R&D and television R&D than any other US company. They had the best technology of making that, and they freely licensed their technology to any and all comers on fair market terms. So what was the problem? The problem was RCA had a monopoly that the government thought was going to raise television prices by 2%. So what did they do? They, by law, made RCA give away every single color television patent to Zenith and Motorola and all these other television firms in the US. Okay, you can say, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that they were forced then to license, because they made a lot of money on licensing, to a firm in Japan called Sony. Without that Department of Justice decision, Sony never would have gotten RCA color TV patents, and the Japanese TV industry would have been set back at least 10 years. So here is the government thinking it knew best about how to structure markets, and it did structure the market in a way that we no longer have a color television industry. So when we're in an industry with all these great benefits, few little harms here and there, but vast benefits, and we're in an intense global competitive race against a country that's putting massive amount of money and unfair favoritism to their champions, the least we can do is let these companies compete and hopefully win.
Okay, I think this is a really interesting example, so I'm glad you raised it. And I want to also just compliment Robert on his excellent book, which I think I've read excerpts of it at this point in your writing, but it's totally worth a read. And it's very thoughtful. I disagree with a couple points that you made. So and maybe we can get into this, I would love to reconcile the idea that we shouldn't be engaging in policy where we have sort of national champions, and I think that's kind of doesn't have an entirely happy history economically in many countries, versus the idea that we should engage in that to protect the U.S. tech companies. So I have a disconnect there. I think that when we think about this RCA example in particular, in general, the evidence tends to favor the view that competition fosters innovation as a really important value. So yes, I'm sure access to the US market spurred the Japanese to improve on RCA's technologies. And if RCA was really a superior firm to those Japanese competitors, then it ought to have been able to outcompete its rivals. Start in understanding the market did move beyond them. And what we can say with confidence, I think, is that a durable monopolist like RCA might not have had the incentives to develop and innovate and commercialize the technologies. So it doesn't really follow for me that that opening up markets and opening up licensing, creating more competition and innovation, no matter where it comes from in the world, is a bad thing. Secondly, I guess I'd say related to this challenge is we're sort of talking around a number of issues here. There's the issue of the power of the companies themselves. There's the issue of whether there's an antitrust problem, a competition problem, an innovation problem, and then there's an issue of whether there are consequences happening in our daily lives around the use of our data, potential manipulation of people, being targeted with disinformation campaigns, losing credible sources of information because they just no longer have a strong business case in this environment, like newspapers, for example, that are also publicly held values that we could decide collectively we wanted to try to direct the markets towards. It's very unlikely, given the market structure, that the outcomes are guaranteed in those directions, and that's what the role of the government is for. So I guess I'd sum up by saying I do think there's a government role. I think there's a government role in responsible antitrust enforcement, which is pretty similar to what Robert and I are talking about. I don't think I have a wildly different view from him there. I say there's a government role in creating more rights for consumers around their data, because I think the market is headed that way, but it's not necessarily a guarantee, and I think in general that would be pro-innovative and pro-competitive and pro-consumer and pro-privacy. I favor the notion of better labeling political ads on these social networks and probably giving consumers and users other tools to detect when something is a political ad. I think that's pretty important. That's government regulation. There's a bill called Honest Ads that's actually bipartisan that's pending right now that I support. And I support the government investing in research and also continuing to advocate for pro-competitive regulation and policies like the open internet regulation and really forcing opening of APIs and interoperability. One of the real challenges here is that Facebook's reaction right now has been to really sort of throw up the walls of a walled garden, which isn't necessarily the best outcome from a competition perspective. So I think we are approaching a point where the government needs to step in. It should do so cautiously with some modesty and being mindful of the fact that usually the government intervention in technology is a bit accidental, and the results of it sort of flow out in ways that the government didn't anticipate at all.
Before we turn to the jury for your questions, let me ask each of you to briefly respond to the following. There's an argument that one of the things that's different today about these digital giants is that with network effects in play, it's very hard for people to see how competition will arise. When Microsoft was challenged 2 decades ago, you had Netscape, you had open source, you had other things. Technology was challenged. When Google came on, they disrupted Yahoo and others, and there were other search engines. As when Facebook came on, there were other networks. Do you think it is possible, each of you, that network effects can be overcome by competition to these 2 giant companies? Let me start with you.
Well, I think what we have to remember, we have this sort of fantasy idealistic view in the United States that somehow that creative destruction goes on all the time in every single industry, and you're lucky if you got 20 or 30 years. The reality is, as we point out in the book, every new wave of innovation ends up with this swarm of competition, this winnowing out, this creation of a few winners, and those winners last long time, 100 years. General Electric was formed in 1902, whenever it was, General Motors. These companies last a long time, and I would expect Facebook and Google to last a long time. I don't think that's the right question. At one point, the leading computer software firm in the United States was General Electric. So they clearly couldn't take what they had and move it into this new space. The question is, is there so much lock-in at Facebook and Google that they're not going to be able to move into this new space? And I think there's a real chance of that. On top of that, there's a chance that you could have disruptive technologies. Now, people talk about blockchain as one of those. I don't know whether that's true, but people certainly talk about it, that you could imagine certainly a Facebook world without an intermediation of a blockchain. We should just be agnostic to that. That certainly could happen.
You want to respond?
I mean, I agree with everything Robert just said, but I think the example makes my case, which is essentially you can't necessarily count on a giant incumbent to be the best driver of innovation. What you need is to make sure the new entrants can get there. And because of the network effects, because of lock-in and some of those issues, the government has a role to play in making sure that we really do get the benefit of innovation. I think network effects are huge in these markets, and I don't think they'll necessarily be overcome, which is why I'm not sure if even if you broke up a company, you would get the same kind of competition occurring that would result in innovation and better quality products and the kinds of things that we would like to see in the market.
Jury, questions? Wait for the microphone to come. Take this gentleman right in front of you, and then we'll come to you next. Oh, he's here. I'm sorry. Let me, this gentleman on my right.
Hi, Jim Cornelson. So to both of you, I'd like to ask to make a comment on self-regulation. Is there a role for government to create guidelines for self-regulation, and can Facebook really monitor its own fake news and bad use of some of the information that's been disseminated? The Journal had an article the other day saying even if they hire 2,000 people, it's a drop in the water compared to the universe that they serve. So would you both make a comment on self-regulation?
So I think, again, I urge you to remember this debate is about size. It's not about all these other problems, which are real. So fake news is a real problem. I generally support the idea of ads. I haven't looked at that bill specifically, but generally support that idea. What I would not support if that bill says you have to disclose ads, but only if you're a company with more than 25 million subscribers. You know, if fake news is fake news. And so the point about self-regulation, if can Facebook do that? Facebook can do that better than, if Facebook were broken up into 10 different companies, they're not going to have the capabilities as much as one Facebook would have. So my argument would be that a company like Facebook has certainly the motivation. One of the things size brings you is an enormous amount of public scrutiny, as we saw 2 weeks ago. I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg was not enjoying that experience. It brings you an enormous amount of scrutiny. It also brings you an enormous amount of expertise and resources that you can apply to that. So if any company in the world is going to solve that problem, I think it's going to be Facebook. So absolutely self-regulation can play an important role. And again, there's a backstop on self-regulation. If you commit to a self-regulatory regime and you violate it, the FTC will and can and should come after you.
Agreed. I'm a fan of self-regulation. I do think this debate is about whether these companies are so powerful that we can rely just on self-regulation for them to just regulate, as opposed to the way Robert's trying to frame it, which I get why you're trying to frame it that way. So I would argue that they are too powerful to rely solely on self-regulation as a primary means, that we are counting on them to think about all the ways that they are going to anticipate and manage the consequences of their technology in our daily lives. And that's why I'm arguing for a range of government roles here.
Please identify yourself.
So I have a question mainly for Robert. One of the things you said struck me as is just plain stretching things. The argument that there can only be one social network. It's the same argument that says there can only be one telephone network and there can only be one electronic mail system.
Only one what?
Electronic mail system. Both our telephone network, which was broken up, and the electronic mail system, which was built to interoperate beautifully with lots of competition with major players. So why is that model not an appropriate model?
Well, I think those are very different networks. When you broke up the telephone network into the 9 RBOCs, we didn't say there are going to be 2 RBOCs in New York. We said there's 1 RBOC in New York. So that really wasn't breaking up monopoly. That was just breaking up a big, giant national firm and creating 9 monopolies. Sure. You split long distance from local, but essentially you were talking about a 1 wire. And so what you're talking about is you could have competition on top of the wire, so you had long distance coming over. But I would argue that social networks are quite different in the sense of who's going to, somehow I'm going to be on Facebook and I'm going to post something and it's going to go to the 9 other social network sites and it's going to be exactly what I want. If you can invent that, and you can, good luck. And by the way, if you can invent it and they try to do this, or a co-op, and they failed miserably. If you can invent it and it works, then it ought to work for consumers. So great. I just don't think it's possible, and I don't think consumers would want it. I don't think the electronic mail is. Electronic mail is just a what is it? A PCP protocol that just sends stuff. But that's different. Social network. It's like, what is my picture? Who are my people? You know, I have this emoji. You have this emoji. It's
Yourself?
Hi, I'm Deb Tillett, and it's probably more of a comment than a question, but sir, you made a remark about RCA and how, you know, by giving it away and then all of a sudden we have Sony. Tell me about the cars. Didn't we have a great monopoly on automobiles and Toyota came along and sort of kicked our, you know, yeah.
So I agree with the commissioner on competition. By the way, I'm not arguing for picking champions. I'm arguing against anti-champions. I'm arguing against the government going after firms and hobbling them. And that's what happened in RCA. In the GM and Ford and Chrysler case, the government didn't go after them, although there's probably a little bit of pressure on GM not to be aggressive. But fine, I think it was, you know, when you look at the net benefits of Toyota coming into this market, they forced those three companies to innovate. I 100% agree with that. That's a very different thing, though, than saying to GM, we're going to take your patents and we're going to license them to anybody else in the world. That's a very radical step, and that's really what the government did in the RCA case. Why were we harmed? The evidence was clearly, by the way, that RCA was the world leader on innovation in color TV, both product and process technology. I can share the studies with you. So it wasn't like they were a lazy monopolist. They were an aggressive monopolist winning for consumers. We broke them up, or we took their IP away and gave it to everybody else, and the result was we lost an industry. I don't believe, by the way, that the only standard in these should be consumer welfare in the following sense. I think having a strong domestic industry in advanced industries that are high technology, the government should not actively work to undermine that, which was the case, by the way, in a recent FTC merger case with Freescale and Lattice Semiconductor, where these two firms merged. It was an American firm acquiring, I believe, a Dutch firm, and they forced them to divest their radio frequency unit because of competition problems. And guess who bought the RF company with a big check from Beijing? It was a Chinese company now, so we've lost that technology. The Chinese have it. We could have kept the technology without this aggressive antitrust.
Was the FTC at fault?
Well, so I would say the FTC is to protect competition and innovation and consumers in the marketplace, and that we have a separate process, the CFIUS process, which looks at the national security and economic implications of foreign purchases of technology. I think we're getting into the argument about whether we should have global markets, which is a good argument to have. I think I would argue we have them.
That the FTC screwed up. Did the FTC screw up?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Let's get some more questions.
Thanks. Brad Schrader. Question, I think, first for Mr. Atkinson, but for both. I'm wondering if our innovation math is overlooking a key segment. The venture industry, many of us in this room, spend 40 to 60 billion a year supporting thousands of startups who arguably are creating and have created over the last 10 years most of the exciting innovations, even in the spaces that Facebook competes in. Shouldn't we be thinking about fostering that ecosystem to continue that same progress? And I don't see how that squares with sustaining large companies like Google and Facebook alone.
So again, in 8 or 7 minutes that you have to sort of make these points, you can't make them in all the nuance and sophistication. One of the main points Mike and I make in this book is the adulation of small firms just because they're small makes no sense. The punishment of large firms because they're large makes no sense. We argue there's two big things government should do. One is don't punish big firms, and the second is enable high-growth startups. Enabling Fred and Sally to open up a pizza parlor to get 3 people, to me, the government shouldn't be involved in that. Helping through a wide set of policies, including allowing venture funds to make money and all these other things. Enabling high-growth startups has to be a key part of policy. I don't see those in
I guess I just think the government has a role to play in making sure that ecosystem is a friendly ecosystem for the smaller companies to enter in, and they can do that by making sure that those companies have access to data, both by releasing government data, but they can also do that by advocating for interoperability. A lot of us enjoy being able to switch mobile phone carriers, but keep our same phone number. Well, guess what? The government made that possible because there isn't an incentive in the marketplace for AT&T, I'm picking on them, to make that possible.
Yes, gentlemen.
Luca. So my question is a little bit for both of you. Back in the day, the technology of the day was either the automobile industry, steel, and telephone and telegraph, and so these were the companies in the day were the Googles and Facebooks of the day. And so to a certain extent, when we're talking about laissez-faire versus how much government regulation at that, I don't know that laissez-faire left to itself, you know, can police itself. And again, there's a part where we say too much government regulation is too much as well. So, but back in the day, there was high barriers to entry into those, quote, technology companies of the day. Today's a whole different thing. There are not the kind of barriers to entry as there was in technology, today's technology as there was in the past. You get a laptop and you get a little space at WeWork and you're in business, so to speak.
Can I perform as an editor and just ask you a question?
Okay, so my question is this: is it possible that a lot of times these large companies like Facebook and Google, and I'm going to mention Intel here, who do not continue to innovate will sort of like create the demise of themselves? Intel, for instance, you know, they were the leaders in the processors, but that was for laptops or computers. Now, they got a big problem because the new technology, it's like you don't put Intel into your cell phone or augmented reality glasses. And so they're probably not going to be the leaders in this next generation. And could Facebook and Google, by just the force of technology and its movement, sort of self-regulates in a very different way that the government may not have to come in?
You want to start with that answer,
Sure.
Commissioner?
Okay, so let me start. I'm glad you raised Intel because that's actually a really interesting case. I think the point you're making is a point that I have also been making, which is very large firms that are even very innovative market leaders that become, through competition and innovation, the monopolists, if you will, of their markets, very often then fail at future innovation and instead really fall back on very protective behavior because they're very mindful of this sort of Schumpeterian idea that there's going to be like corruption coming that will disintermediate them. So what they do is they start using some really nice tactics to protect their monopoly, and then the antitrust enforcers come in. So the FTC actually has a case on Intel where we were looking at market share-based discounting tax on customers who switched to rivals. It was making it very hard for customers to switch to rival chip makers. So that was a big deal. We took action on that. So we're looking at that behavior where it becomes very hard for the market to continue to yield a competitive and innovative result. And very often we see that kind of behavior who are because competition is not necessarily like everybody's best friend. That's why that we have a government with competition enforcers to be sort of referenced in the marketplace.
Well, look, that's very different. Whether Intel abused their market share or not is an empirical thing, and you said they didn't. Fine, I'm not going to argue that. But if they did, then you did the right thing, and that's what government is supposed to do. It's supposed to go after behavior or conduct. To your point, Sal, you know, if you remember your history, people thought that the telegraph system was the dominant monopoly. Alexander Graham Bell went to the telegraph company and tried to sell his patent for telephony, and they were too stupid to figure it out. And they went out of business, or more, actually they just went out of business about a couple years ago. Same thing with the telephone system. The telephone system should have been the dominant internet player, and they couldn't figure it out. Intel should have gone into mobile chips, and ARM did it instead. Intel should have gone into AI chips, and NVIDIA has done it instead faster. So the history of innovation is the history of firms not being smart enough sometimes and losing. And as long as that's continued to be the dynamic, which I believe it will, as long as the FTC sort of stays on as they cop on the beat, rather than an oppressive overlord beating all the winners, then I think we're in okay shape.
You have a question?
Hi,
those communities, but yet they're taking their 30% pound of flesh. And so when you talk to the workers, they don't generally, I think they're not very positive Uber drivers. What's the answer? That's not so much an issue around, I guess it's a market power issue, but it's really a societal impact issue. And to some extent, you can deal with that with regulation, but it's also, I'll give one last example. Apple does not let Amber Alerts on its system, doesn't believe in it, doesn't have to, right? And so, can you force them? I suppose you can, but they argue privacy. So that's the thing that I'm curious about. When you have that much tech, you can sort of move at will, and it doesn't cost you much to expand, but it certainly costs some of those communities at times.
Okay, so I think that's a great point. And I think a lot about specifically the sharing economy examples that you're raising, whether ride sharing in a platform like Uber or Airbnb and I don't know what we call it at this point, housing. On the one hand, at the FTC, we advocate to lower the regulatory barriers for those new entrants, because very often what we see, especially in local government and state government, are incumbents that have a lot of power and want to keep them out. So we don't really want that to happen, because they do provide good competition and innovation for consumers. We want them to be able to enter. But if there are consequences that affect a community, it's also completely legitimate to hone in on what those harms are and collectively decide how to protect against them. So I think that we also advocate to allow local governments to step in, and I think on Uber it's very much a local government issue, so is Airbnb, to decide how they want to regulate the use of that platform. If it's having a big impact on available housing stock, you could study that, you can take a look at it, you can decide that you're going to limit the number of units people can have for Airbnb or whatever policy you want to engage in. I think you want to do that carefully and thoughtfully and with a very clear sense of where the problem is that you're trying to address, as opposed to just unilaterally with a broad brush kind of outlawing something.
So just quickly on that, that's an important debate to be having, but it has nothing to do with size. And I think that's my point. If I want to win this debate, I've got to win it on size. We can have an argument about Airbnb and Uber. Austin, Texas, for a while did not allow Uber in. The last time I went to South by was the year before. I went this year, they had Uber. But they had like 5 little Ubers, which, can you imagine how many, for all of you who travel, how many hundreds of Uber apps different Uber company apps would you need on your cell phone? That's why there's Uber and Lyft, by the way, because we don't want 100, I don't want the New York one when I came up here today. But if we're going to talk about the regulations of wages or working conditions or fees and all that stuff, then we have to say that those 5 Uber-ish companies in Austin have to be subject to them the same. I just don't see this as a size issue.
I think it is a size issue. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I wouldn't want the government to be solving this problem for me. One of the solutions is you don't allow them to have a market share to such an extent that that they can sort of take 30%. Somebody else comes in and takes one. In Austin, one of the advantages was drivers were getting a higher percentage of the fees that were paid. For some locals, that meant a lot.
For the consumers, it didn't.
We have one more question because everyone's ready for a drink, I think. No, the gentleman in the back with
Hello?
the...
Hi.
the
Hi,
gentleman
Jim
with the
Spanfeller.
microphone.
Just to sort of get back to the big company thing and to focus, although great questions, to focus on sort of the 2 companies that have been sort of the center of this discussion, Facebook and Google. I would tell you or suggest that the concept that the KPI around this should be advertising is in fact wrong. I think the KPI around this should be data, and specifically first-party data. And if you look at the sort of discussion and the way you've laid it out on both sides, I think there is a meaningful difference in how you approach this. If you think about the fact that their monopolistic position around first-party data is very low.
That you're saying they have monopoly in data. Is that your point?
Yeah, that their market share in first-party data is much
Very
larger
high,
than their
yeah.
market share is in terms of advertising, which is also very, very large.
I think this is an interesting question. There's also some people who are sort of rethinking the idea of attention markets, which I think is hard to scope, but is an interesting area as well. It's certainly possible for the antitrust tools to conceive of those issues and to look at the market power within those markets as well.
But as I say, there are lots of cases where companies had dominant data and they lost out. Apple had their music system before Spotify. You had MySpace. It had more data than Facebook. I don't see data as data is a non-rival versus good. I give my data to Facebook. Business model can come out and get large amounts of data. By the way, only if, this is the other point. There was a new study that came out yesterday, and I haven't read it, but it was an interesting study. I think you may have seen it, on the effect of the GDPR as in ensconcing the dominant or the share of market by Google and Facebook in Germany, in Europe. So I think we have to really worry about that if you start locking all the, and the same thing, by the way, with the Facebook change on how it opened with other companies on that. Facebook never would have done that if they hadn't been forced by this public outcry to not release data. And one of the results of that was potentially some anti-competitive problems. They weren't doing that on their own. They were opening up that data. So I actually think that there's a risk that we could go the other way and lock in more data if we regulate.
Well, with that note, I want to thank our two speakers for doing an excellent